I think going to be jointly moderating. At least I'm going to plan on moderating by voice and rely on Anthony to mute people and tell me what I've missed that happens on chat, stuff like that. So I'm going to plan on talking and rambling for a little bit while to get things started and answer some questions about the Ngrc voting information and the like that we had planned on, forming some answers to. And then the hope is that we can also have this be like a live, involved, chaotic discussion. And to manage the imminent chaos, then our suggestion is that you especially type questions that you want to ask into the chat window. And I'll be taking a look at the chat. Anthony will as well and help collate. So we should be able to have a roughly orderly conversation about that. Okay, yeah, and just in terms of setting the scope for this, so it's been really cool to see all of the enthusiasm for Hudson Jameson's suggested live streams of questions and answers for the NGRC candidates, rather than just the Zcash Foundation functionaries as it pertains to the NGRC. So this isn't that. I don't think any of the candidates are here, and this is mainly intended as a question and answer for how we're going to run the vote, what the Zcash Foundation side of this. So those will all be separate talks. And sorry to anyone who came here because they're confused about what that is. Hopefully that's clear enough. Okay, so maybe we'll get into it, and I'll start by trying to answer some of the questions that we've already heard about, and then try to form some answers to. And I have 3 of those. It's going to be about a little bit more details about what the voting procedure is going to look like how we'll handle ties and runoff, stuff like that. We want to answer some questions about the operational structure of how the Zcash Foundation plans to interface with the MGRC, because while it's supposed to be a separate entity, we are planning to at least initially be the official dispenser of the major grants that get chosen as a result of this. So second topic is to talk a bit about our view of how we plan on interacting with the MGRC. And then the last topic that we plan to talk about is what we are expecting or think is going to be about the structure of the MGRC itself, like what kind of rules we expect that they would follow. So those are the 3 topics I have planned to talk about. Other stuff than that, I encourage you all to fill the chat with, and we'll try to do question and answer over that. So I think the simple one to get out of the way is to talk a bit about what the voting procedure is going to be like. So you've seen the Helios votes that we have done for previous community advisory panel votes. This is going to be roughly the same structure. I think what I can do is I already made a draft template of the Helios vote. This answers some of the questions, like what you would expect to see when you vote on it. I think it's actually safe for me just to paste the link of this here. It doesn't give you read privilege to anything except the form of the questions. Let me go double check that I can open this in an incognito window real quick. Tested this and I'm pretty sure it works. Yeah, that should just simply be publicly visible. So this is going to be approval voting. So there's only one question. It'll be a little bit simpler than the ballots that we've had previously. All of the candidates will be listed there. In Helios, I get to check an option for present the candidates in random order. So they're listed here in the order they show up in the forum post. But when you actually go to log into your Helios vote, if you're on the CAP, then you would see them in a random order. It's approval voting, so you get to select as many as you want. You could select all of the candidates or none of the candidates. That would have no impact on the outcome. You could select half of them or just your favorite. You could select 5 because 5 is the number of seats that we're going to fill. Our plan is to pick the 5 people with the greatest total number of votes. The way Helios works is, you cast the vote. It's a secret ballot. You get like a little hash commitment of your ballot that's posted to the public website so everyone can see the commitment to it. And at the end, all we will disclose, all we will even get to see is just the total sum, number of votes for each candidate received. And the problem is that, of course, there could be, not a unique top 5 candidates. It's possible that there's, tie, a 6-way tie, for example, for the top 6 all have the same number of votes. So what we've put partial thought into formulating is how we're going to handle runoffs and tiebreakers. So this is what our plan is for handling this. We want to avoid having to basically do a whole iteration of contacting the CAP if possible, just because that's delays and operational difficulty, stuff like that. So the plan that we have is that if there are a unique top 3 or a unique top 4, meaning that there's a tie, but only among the 4th or 5th place, then our plan will be to allow the 3 uniquely chosen people to select from among the tied people for the 4th and 5th seat. In the case that there are, a tie for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th positions, for example, or something more than that, then our plan will be to redo a runoff poll, like another Helios vote for the CAP, with just the people who tied for the, being in the top 5. It's hard to work through what all of the different, eventualities could be, but I think that that's a pretty decent compromise. Happy during this call to have, thoughts on that or feedback on it. Yeah, Anthony?
Oh, we have a question, and sure. I think it's best if I answer. So when will new members get added to the CAP? So on Monday, we expanded the CAP pool. It was by invite of current CAP members. The mixture of those 2 email correspondents increased the CAP size to 61, which is great. I hope everyone votes. The way that they will get added, they're on September 1st, once we're done, expanding the pool, I will update the link on the website that says who the current members are. And then on the 7th, I will email everyone the Helios link to vote.
Yep. Okay, so yeah, you're welcome throughout this to add more questions about the tie procedure, their voting logistics kind of details, but that's mainly what I had in mind to explain that.
Have we written that up somewhere publicly in case it happens and someone argues us for pulling this out of a hat and we don't want to have to point them at some link to a video?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we should post, I have notes that we wrote down to make sure that this made enough sense that I could say it in complete sentences on this call, but I think we can make a forum post summarizing any, interesting stuff we talk about here. But no, I don't think we've posted that yet, so that'll be a new post when we make it. So the next topic that I wanted to discuss about are what limitations are imposed on the MGRC by the nature of the MGRC being essentially advising the MGRC, the Zcash Foundation, on how to administer the major grants. So we have several procedures that we follow, like, we have to do KYC and OFAC compliance on grants that we issue. So we've previously done several rounds of grants. They've mostly been smaller grants, and we tried the grants.io format and did some grants through there. So, we've had a process that is basically the minimum amount of due diligence that we have to do in order to make grants to someone else to do. So this mainly includes like KYC and OFAC compliance. Like, we can't hire someone that's on the OFAC sanctions list, and we have to have like a real name identity for anyone who we give a grant to. So if we are administering the grants in that way, we would have to follow the same policies, even if the choice of the grants is made by the MGRC. Conceptually, the MGRC might, pseudonymously choose someone or choose to approve a major grant without knowing their real name. That wouldn't change the fact that we, to administer it, would have to go collect their information. A similar related one is that, we can only do actions that are, deemed in support of our mission. And I don't think that this is likely to be a obstacle to the MGRC. It doesn't really, our mission is defined in such a way that I think, anything that the MGRC would like to do most likely fits within our mission because it's defined very broadly. If we are administering the grants in that way, we do have to be able to justify it against what our mission is. So we can't do something that's, completely at odds with our mission, which includes, developing privacy infrastructure for the public at large. It is possible that I think, things pertaining to investing in a for-profit company, I know that these have been a bunch of the discussions that folks have had. I don't fully know exactly where the line of that would be drawn, so that's not really something that I can fully explain where such a limit would be. I know that our intent is to allow the NGRC to run completely independently, and it doesn't have to be subject to our choice, and we certainly don't have to impose our sense of priorities on what the Zcash Foundation would do. The only thing that I'm pointing this out, though, and for the sake of having the discussion about, is that given the way that this structure is formed, it's the Zcash Foundation that would be dispersing the grants, and therefore has to explain how they are compatible with our mission and with any legal limitations that we have to do.
And again, all of this is a requirement because we're 501c3 and there are a bunch of transparency and legal requirements put on us.
Yeah.
So
maybe a dumb question because I'm probably out of the loop, but why is the MGRC under the Zcash Foundation instead of a separate entity?
So this is a good question, and the ZIP 1014 says that it should be. It doesn't necessarily go into all of the details why. The 1014 zip was chosen in lieu of several other, some of the other proposals that it beat out when we had chosen it included forming a separate independent organization, like an entire separate corporation, rather than doing it this way. And so this was the one that won. So that's one reason to, say that. My view of the rationale for it, is that this is really more of an expedience issue rather than this is inherently how it should work. The obstacle of trying, because there was a fairly short time period, right? The saying that, well, in order for this to work, it would have had to have an organization formed in that time, I think would have been too big of an obstacle to be able to form it in that short timeline.
I don't think that's quite accurate, Andrew, actually. So there was a whole discussion about whether there'd be a third entity or not. And some people, I think yourself included, wanted there to be one. There was some concern about practicality of setting one up quickly. And there was a lot of concern about just the viability of doing it in general and risking that you got a complete another mess of cryptocurrency governance. And so the decision not to do it was a combination of, yes, expediency, but also one of the strong arguments that was flying around at the time this was voted on was just that we didn't want a third entity, right? That was sort of, to a certain degree, explicitly rejected amongst the other proposals. And of course, the degree to which you think people rejected it because they didn't want it versus expediency is an open question. But that was the debate that was flying around at the time.
So here's my view of what the what this means for the starting point and what the future of it could be. So given that the goal is for the NGRC to operate as independently as possible, I think that it would be plausible for the NGRC to decide that it would like to be able to incorporate separately. We basically discussed this as a possibility that could happen, not necessarily something we are encouraging or trying to set up, but that's something that I think would be possible, and I don't think that we would oppose that. The MGRC, I think, is going to have to self-determinate. So this is kind of bleeding into the other discussion that I wanted to discuss, but that can go this way. It's basically what would the next steps look like? So what happens immediately after the vote closes? So once we identify 5 people who are going to form the MGRC, we're expecting to basically leave it to themselves to decide how they want to operate. So a lot of the questions that have been rising are what exactly would be the internal governance structure of NGRC? Would it require unanimous votes or majority votes? Would there be a single leader who works there full time? Would they compensate themselves in some way? And our view of this is that it should be up to them to self-determine. So what I anticipate happening is the immediate next step after the MGRC forms is that they have their first initial 5-person meeting. The Zcash Foundation folks don't have to be present at them at all. I think they should basically just find the 5 of themselves in a virtual room and try to discuss among themselves how they would like to operate, who would like to take on roles like chair, secretary, other things to do like that.
Wait, does ZIP 1014 let MGRC incorporate, or it's like actually somewhat explicit?
You know, the zip says how the MGRC, you know, will form. I don't think that it specifically says they cannot incorporate.
I think you're playing fast and loose with that. We have a structure that was picked, and then you're saying, well, now it gives all autonomy to them. And I don't think either that's the intent or explicitly what it says. I don't have the thing up in front of my head, but this is not that open to interpretation, was my recollection last time I read it. For example, to go back to the question that you were covering about caveats on money, right? Right now, the ZIP is explicit that it goes through ZF&D, right? That was the deciding thing in the vote.
Yes.
So my understanding is that the ZIP is explicit that the MGRC would not be a separate legal entity. And I think it would require a new ZIP and the corresponding governance process to approve it in order for the MGRC to incorporate. However, I think that once the MGRC is up and running and is showing independence, it would be easy to achieve that consensus and get the community's approval of such a process.
Yeah.
A lot depends on some questions that I guess we'll be discussing later today about the administrative aspects and the time investment of the MGRC members, and is it really capable of serving all the extra work done by a separate corporate entity?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, I guess another way to say that is that the MGRC is very specific, or the ZIP is very specific about what its structure, you know, will be, and any future change to that, you know, could be proposed by them. I agree with the way that you would put it, that this would go up to, you know, a further change to the ZIP and whatever ensuing community approval process would be associated with that.
We have some questions that were asked a little earlier. One from Chili Bob. All winning candidates equal, or does whoever with the most votes get to be the MGRC chair or spokesperson?
So, I mean, we simply don't have a prescription for how that should go. My view of what again, the intent is for them to be able to begin meeting and self-determine through, you know, their discussions and what they want to do after meeting each other and discussing it amongst themselves, how they would like to form in those details. We, you know, had a discussion about, you know, what's the minimum amount of structure that we have to recognize, and I think that the, you know, root structure that we can't get away from is majority vote. Like, if we sign up 5 people and they write back like 5 different emails to us, you know, expressing different sides of something, I think what we will start by accepting is majority vote being the will of the MGRC. But the expectation is that any further structure beyond that, in terms of delegating duties, identifying a point person, I think it's very practical to define a point person. I imagine that a way that the Zcash Foundation and the MGRC will operate after that is that, you know, we'll have frequent calls, or, you know, assign someone in the Zcash Foundation to, you know, frequently communicate with someone from the MGRC. But whether they want to do it all 5 of them, or make a subcommittee, or identify one person as a chair, I think I would leave it up to them. So I would not read anything that's like the person with the most votes automatically has some additional structure in that panel.
We have a second question. What will happen with the remaining Zcash Foundation funds for grants that is on hold due to the MGRC forming? Is it returned to the ZF operational budget?
I don't know about that.
I'm happy to take that one.
Sure.
For full disclosure, we've spent about $250,000 on grants this year. In the ZIP, the foundation is also allowed to give out grants. We will probably earmark money next year for grants as well.
Will any more grants be distributed this year, Anthony?
We are currently still distributing money towards grants, so we will continue to pay out the grants that are completing milestones, and that's all available on the grant platform.
But no new ones, right?
Currently, no.
For 2020?
Correct. There's some good conversation on the efficiency of being a nonprofit, whether it's inside of the foundation or its own nonprofit in terms of, I would hate to use the word tax avoidance, but maybe minimizing tax risk, or as DC has stated, avoiding taxation / maximizing tax efficiency. I think that also that nonprofits are mission driven, so we're not here to make a bottom line.
Yeah, and the I mean the MGRC, at least as it's initially formed, it doesn't have any corporate entity, right? So we're formally treating it as an advisory panel for then grants issued by the Zcash Foundation.
We have some questions about keeping this as a U.S. jurisdiction, inside a U.S. jurisdiction.
So I don't think that there's anything US-centric about the MGRC itself. Again, any action that the Zcash Foundation makes in terms of dispersing funds to someone for some purpose, that has to be matched against the requirements of our US jurisdiction.
Oh, here's a good question. Oh, I'm sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
I think I had fizzled out and that was the end of that thought, so go ahead.
When do the new grants acceptance start?
I don't think that there's any timeline specifically that says when the MGRC has to be, running well enough to start accepting grants. I guess I had sort of circled around this point, but and it's a little bit fuzzy. But what I want to convey is like, what are as the foundation, like what our standpoint is going to be in terms of how well we're going to push the MGRC along. So the posture that I want to convey is that we don't want to make a clone of ourselves that defeats the kind of diversity benefit of having this separate organizational structure. So we want to encourage and help the MGRC get going while not dictating to them how they should operate. One of the phrases that the ZIP 1014 says is that we should try to set performance metrics and set goals. So, the way that I'm viewing it is that we should be trying to facilitate as much as possible. Like we shouldn't, manage them to the point of view of telling them what to do, but we should offer our operational resources as much as possible, for example, to help them, coordinate and move effectively. So I would imagine that one of the things that we do quickly after, say, they have their own first initial meeting of the MGRC is then have, a second meeting with us, which is when we would try to, for example, get them to commit to timelines. And plan for when they would accept grants and begin a process. Like a typical grant procedure is like defining priorities, announcing some time intervals when people should treat it as a deadline and submit, and when they could expect review decisions. That's just something that I would imagine is the structure that they come up with, and I would say we would suggest or encourage something like that. But the bottom line is dates like that are to be decided by the MGRC.
We have two questions. Can we, going fast there. Can we delay grants until year 2 of MGRC and use year 1 as initialization?
I don't see anything that says that we can't. I mean, to me, that personally seems too slow.
Yeah, I'd hope we wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I'd hope we wouldn't too. But it's for the MGRC to decide how they would run that.
And then do resources include administrative resources, reporting, grant management, or are the committee members expected to do that?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So this kind of also relates to, who righteously should be on the hook for expending the, effort for this. Perhaps it also hinges on whether or not MGRC, decide that it makes sense for MGRC members to, have staff or hire themselves to perform staff roles. So if we give grants, we already have to do some amount of following up and grant, management. So as these grants, at least as the ZIP says, as we're planning on doing it, will be issued by Zcash Foundation to the recipients of the grants. We can't issue grants and then completely abdicate responsibility for managing the grants. So naturally, I think we would at least be on the hook for some of the operational effort of handling and managing the grants. on the other hand, I like the idea that the Ngrc would start to form their own, process for also following up with and working with the grant recipients. So again, the viewpoint is, we've discussed this, and I think we are prepared to have such operational resources and offer them to the Ngrc. But they could also act independently if they're, willing and able.
I would like to chime in and stress that this is non-trivial. There is a substantial amount of work that would be needed to support the Ngrc doing the fun stuff of deciding things. I've seen this work out with the previous grant rounds, where we also already had Ngrc light committees formed within the foundation, and I happened to be on those, and we got a lot of support from Anthony and Josh in making those things happen and in following up on everything. And now we're going to move to a different scale now with the Ngrc. So there's definitely a burden there, and I appreciate the foundation stepping in to shoulder it.
Excellent, yeah.
Also, does ZIP 1014 allow the MGRC to pay itself or not? I've heard like backs and forths on this, right? I know the forum ran with them being paid. I've also heard people say otherwise. Like, this is me again asking questions on a thing that I can never remember all the text of.
I believe the ZIP does not specifically say that they cannot be paid.
Wait, doesn't it say that they have to be dispersed as grants?
Can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, I can hear you there.
There was some back and forth about whether to include a paragraph that explicitly said that MGRC members should be paid expenses, I think, reasonable expenses. ECC management was not in favor of including that paragraph, but the reasoning was, if I understand correctly, that the ZIP allowed it anyway without explicitly saying it.
Wait, so the major grant, ZIP says funds shall be received and administered by ZF must be dispersed as major grants, right? That seems to pretty clearly say the only thing you can do with the money is pay people in grants. Am I missing something? I'm a cryptographer, not a lawyer, but.
Yeah, there is some discussion on the PR. I can find it if you like and put it in the chat.
So it's not a settled thing then, right?
Just speaking as ZIP editor, I can't really interpret that.
A major grant could be a major grant to the MGRC, could it? Or is that ruled out?
I don't know. I guess where I'm coming from is I'm a little concerned that a bunch of people. We had a whole debate on what the community wanted to do. We voted on the ZIP, and then as I've been watching the discussions, it seemed that everybody's been running with all the ideas they had beforehand, regardless of the effect of the election and the outcome of voting on the ZIP. And so I'm just not sure what we constrained, what we didn't. Right, and so
I think that there are broadly, a spectrum between two views that, exactly where the ends of the spectrum lie in terms of what's allowed or not according to the ZIP. Maybe the edges of that are ambiguous, but the general spectrum is like how actively involved the MGRC should be in terms of, acting like an operational engine and stirring things along, as opposed to being mainly passive and review oriented. I think that this relates to that.
Well, that's a separate question of like, do you solicit proposals or not? But some of the like basic operational things, like, is it a third entity? What jurisdiction is it? Do they pay things? These seem to be things we, for better or worse, settled, what was it, a year ago? 6 months ago? I forget when we went through this whole debate. It's been, so many things have happened.
The way that we had talked about it, if we decided that we needed to support an MGRC that wishes to, be paid for the time it takes them to do their activities, the structure by which we'd be able to do that, I'm not saying in terms of the ZIP, but just in terms of what the foundation can do, would be to hire the MGRC members as contractors to fulfill the, task they assigned themselves to do. For example, like nominating one of them to be, full-time involved in, directing and keeping up with grant recipients.
Yeah. Right, but that's a different question over whether the MGRC actually, per the ZIP, is allowed to pay itself.
Sure.
Yes, clearly ZF can hire people. subject to some small sets of constraints. But that's not what the question about the zip is.
So my interpretation of the zip, and this is just my personal interpretation of it, I guess, but my interpretation of it is that it, is not so specific as to rule out expenses associated with operating the MGRC.
Seems to be really clear. It says that ZF can't pay it to anything but grants. So I suppose if we allow some weird contrivance that it's a grant that funds their
the grant management grant.
Yeah, which maybe that's self-dealing. I don't know.
Yeah, so I pasted on the chat the discussion. I had remembered it correctly. Yeah, so
I think it was cropped, but.
Well, Zuko replied, in the final negotiations between ECC and ZF over the application of the trademark to ZIP 1014, we decided not to make this change. In other words, saying that ZF should compensate MGRC members for their time and reasonable expenses, because we did not feel it necessary, and only necessary changes should be made to the ZIP.
I mean, I can't speak to back channel discussions, but at some point that conclusion's irrelevant, right? Like, there's a public process that was voted on. What Zuko or Josh Cincinnati thought is not the deciding factor.
True, but I'm saying the only reason it wasn't included was that Zuko said, acting on behalf of ECC, said that he didn't think it was necessary.
Well, it's hard to say if a small decision in what was presented as that initial zip that we could agree on would have been, voted on that way.
Okay. I included the truncated part.
Yeah. I think ultimately it's, well, actually, I guess it's, so I guess that might go to the accountability of the MGRC and how that looks. What are your thoughts on that, Andrew?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to explain that?
Me? No. I want you to explain it. Okay.
So what we are planning on, and this is maybe an example of some structure that we are planning to expect from the NGRC. So we have, for example, a conflict of interest policy that we've adopted internally for Zcash Foundation members, like that we have to disclose conflicts of interest and recuse ourselves, for example, from decisions the foundations have to make dealing with things involving other consulting we do, something like that. So we would basically plan to hold the MGRC to the same conflict of interest disclosure policy. So NGRC members, should not be, they should recuse themselves from votes on grants in which they're involved in some way. And they should disclose relevant conflicts of interest, to the MGRC and to us, the Zcash Foundation. We're also planning on requiring of them, the same kind of level of reporting in terms of when it comes to administering grants or dispersing grants, we would already report those on our 990 non-profit required financial disclosures. So our plan would be to, naturally anything that we as the Zcash Foundation do, we're still subject to that same reporting. So some of that is automatic just by virtue of MGRC, advising it, but us formally doing the disbursement of that. Our expectation would basically be to hold the MGRC to, the same kinds of public disclosure policies that we have to do.
So I think that the high level summary, and don't hold me to this, is something along the lines of, you obviously can't embezzle the money. You can't do weird things with it that violate accountability or violate even just ZF's mission broadly defined in terms of the nonprofit stuff, because that's the obligation we get from the structure. The NGRC is perfectly free to ineffectively spend their money in service of the mission. And I would hope that if they do that for a while, the community will replace them.
Yeah.
But ZFND is not going to be the people who does that. We don't have that role, I don't think. But note the caveat there. You can ineffectively spend it in things that are supported by the mission of the community and everything. You can't ineffectively spend it on cars and steaks and suites at the Four Seasons or whatever it is. That would get you in deep shit trouble.
There are still a bunch of questions in the chat that we haven't gone through.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thanks for highlighting in our notes. Let me discuss. This was a good puzzle we discussed. So, if I mentioned that we decided that we would interpret MGRC like ambiguity within the MGRC in terms of majority vote from the MGRC members. I think a question is how the MGRC could, for example, change its own membership structure. For example, what happens if one of the MGRC members wants to leave or has to leave? What's the process for dealing with that? This is something that I think is unspecified in the ZIP, but I think the natural answer that I'm just simply in favor of is to say that the root of authority of the MGRCs is from their majority vote. And so I believe that their majority vote would also be able to change their membership. They could, with a majority vote to replace one of their members. Again, my opinion of this is to be fairly allowing the MGRC to be independent. So, my view of it is that they could also vote to, change their number of members or add new members. I think anything that's a change to that, goes against the specifics of the ZIP. For example, the ZIP saying that they are 5 members. Regardless, I think that once they're formed, it's their authority to do it, not the Zcash Foundation's authority to choose how their membership evolves. And at a minimum, viewing it that way allows them to make immediate decisions if they have to, like if one of their members falls ill or something.
No, wait, aren't they elected by the community governance panel? Isn't that how this is run per the ZIP?
Yeah.
Sorry,
but once elected, they are a body that can operate on majority vote.
But that doesn't extend to electing members, I don't think. Someone correct me if I'm wrong.
My understanding is that they are only determined by a poll. They cannot self-appoint or self-perpetuate.
That was my understanding as well.
Yeah, there's no clarity on the ZIP about future, like once it's established what the future is.
There's a comment about that it encourages the MGRC to continue to include community input in the form of our community approval panel or successor processes. So I would say that that's an example of something indicating how it should continue to get community input.
So I'll bring it back to some questions. There is a discussion about commitment, or I'm sorry, compensation as well. Whether, how do we optimize compensation and maximize the amount of money given out?
I don't see that question here.
It's more of a conversation.
Okay.
Here's one. Could the MGRC request that the CAP to vote upon any ambiguities in ZIP 1014?
I think it's pretty interesting. I mean, I'm a little wary, we don't formally have a process of regularly convening the community approval panel. This will be the 3rd time that we've done it. Each time we've done it, this one, no exception. I feel like I wish we had, started on the whole process earlier, allowed more time for things. I'm a little wary of setting a habit of depending exclusively on the Zcash community approval panel, or having it to be, it's a target for being gamed at some point. The more frequently it is used, or the more often it changes its structure, I think there's a risk of relying on it too much. So I don't think that the ZIP says how they could or not. We currently don't have any policy that says exactly, how and when we would convene a community approval panel. But, in short, I think they could. And I certainly think that they could request it. And there's nothing that prevents us from, following such a request.
I'm looking at the zip right now. I guess following what Ian was saying, because it is important how the board members are elected in the future. So it says under 7, which major grants slice, and then number 7, they shall have a 1-year term and may sit for re-election. It doesn't explicitly say then how the election process occurs. However, it does say the Zcash Foundation shall continue to operate the panel and should work to make it more representative and independent. So yeah. I think the clearest interpretation to me is sort of like it seemed to me like the clearest intent is that the community panel would vote every year. So if there was something that indicated that the board members would regularly do a majority vote, let's say that the panel chooses 5 board members, chooses 5 board members. One of them is a bit different than the rest, and day 1 they're immediately removed and replaced with someone else. I think those are things we should at least be aware of potentially happening.
Yeah, I think there might be some ambiguity in how you select recess appointments, so to speak, like if someone leaves. But it's very clear the term's a year and you sit for re-election, and the only election mechanism described in the ZIP is the community governance panel. So that's how that is going to go down.
Does it make sense to have all committee members up for election each and every year? What risk does that provide to continuity?
It might not, and that might be something that we want to amend. But if we amend it, that has to go through a vote in the same way that we voted on the original ZIP. And you may be right that we should do that, but I want to be very clear, because all due respect, Andrew, nothing you said earlier was accurate. The committee members are currently, per the ZIP, elected to 1-year terms and subject to re-election by the same mechanism for which they're re-elected, which is the community governance panel, right? Or a successor, right? The ZIP does provide that we can decide on the successor. But unless we decide on the successor being the major grant committee itself, a thing I would strenuously object to, they don't get to appoint themselves.
That's interesting. Yeah, I had kind of in a factual way interpreted that last sentence of part 7 a little bit differently. It is clearly that, yes, they may sit for re-election, and the community approval panel is clearly the method by which they were elected, and the only mechanism for election that has that is mentioned anywhere. So there's much more support for, I think, interpreting this as specifically the community approval panel or successor process being the mechanism by which they're reelected. But initially my view of this was that, well, they were up for election, it wasn't specified what mechanism would be their reelection.
I mean, it doesn't say the major grant review committee shall initially be selected by the ZCAP or successor process. It just says shall be selected. So I would assume that would continue unless explicitly decided otherwise, and presumably explicitly deciding otherwise would have to be ratified by the ZCAP. If we've exhausted that topic, I had a question earlier that seems to have been skipped.
Yeah, sorry, Dara. If you don't mind reading it, there's a lot of conversation.
So some of the candidates, Keck and I think DC, have mentioned the MGRC investing in grantees, so some kind of profit sharing maybe, rather than only giving grants. I don't see anything about that in ZIP 1014. Is it consistent with the ZIP?
My take, again, being the person who frankly has not read all the ZIP all the time, was that the ZIP doesn't mention it either way, but it is, you could do grants that way. Nonprofits are even allowed to do this, and there's nothing that prohibits them from doing it. So yeah, they could.
What do the candidates think about this? Because obviously that would be taking on more financial risk, maybe, than just giving grants. I don't know.
How do you figure? Seems like grants are you get no return no matter what. Investments are maybe there's a chance. I agree. It may or may not be a good idea. That's up to the candidates.
It depends whether you would invest more than you would have granted.
Good point.
I think actually quite few of the candidates are on this call. So again, this is not the best venue just of how it's set up to get their input on that.
There is a good question. Do we want to implement, based on the previous conversation before the investment conversation, do we want to implement ZIP 14 verbatim as is, or do we want to resolve some of the ambiguities and make some minor improvements? Example, all members being up re-election simultaneously at this point. So do we want to make that decision on this call right now? Are we in the capacity to do that?
I mean, would it be clear just to include a vote in the next panel topic to be like, should we stagger, in certain quarterly elections, or should we do just all once a year?
I mean, the ZIP wording was kind of difficult to agree between ECC and the ZF, and it would be opening a bit of a can of worms to kind of renegotiate the ambiguities.
I don't think that we should do any new items on this ZCAP ballot. Although, reconvening the community approval panel for the sake of answering such questions, especially if they end up being, very relevant to what the MGRC wants to do, then I would say at a later vote, at a later community approval panel would be a good way to do that.
Hey, can I ask a question? I've tried to ask it 2 ways in text, and I feel like it's really relevant because I think even if we were to try to resolve ambiguities before MGRC is established, I think it's very likely that after MGRC is established, different people might disagree on how to interpret ZIP 1014. So if that happens, what happens next? Like, who will notice that? How will we resolve it? Is there any plan?
You're going to say something, Anthony?
Oh, no, I think that's a great question. So who is the MGRC accountable to ZF or to the community, to the CAP? It seems to be
it's tricky. I mean, they should be accountable to the community. I think that the CAP is one very effective way of gauging the input of the community, but not uniquely or best possible, suited to that. At least its low frequency of being able to operate is, one of those. So, I mean, I think that we have to, the things that we've said in terms of what we plan to hold them accountable in terms of disclosures and like minimum requirements and like our conflict of interest policy, for example, are part of those.
I mean, there is a whole section in the ZIP on what the major grants are supposed to be doing, and therefore who the MGRC is accountable to.
I mean, so I think that we have the ability to. Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I think that we have the ability. We clearly, as the Zcash Foundation, have several authority, or being that we're the conduit for the grants that way. We have some we're clearly in the right position to push back on holding them accountable if they're trying to do something completely inconsistent with the ZIP, for example. My view is that we should, as little as possible, try to influence what decisions they come to.
I feel like what I want is some sort of, it's like a fire alarm that anyone could pull. So maybe it could be like the ZF has an official concern or complaint process.
A complaints thread on the forum.
Maybe, but I guess the thing about a fire alarm is like anyone can pull it, but there's a cost to pulling it. Like if you just pull it spuriously, people don't like that and you get in trouble. But anyone can pull it. So I feel like there's something about that balance that that's nice, although I don't know how to do that when you have a large community with like pseudonymous
Wait,
people.
isn't the accountability mechanism currently that they're up for re-election every year?
Right. I guess I'm wondering about what if something is happening on a faster time scale? Like
Sure.
they're gonna give themselves a salary, and some people think, oh, that makes sense. Some people are like, what? That doesn't make sense. So can some people say, hey, we need to get the Zcap together now, and I'm ringing the special bell that means get all the Zcap people together, or something like that?
I think informally we, have all of that, and then like technically there wasn't a governance process, so the Zcap would have to vote on adding the governance process and then invoking it. But I'm reasonably comfortable with that being ad hoc at the moment, right? So like one of the things that we're all software developers, and most of us are, we try to come up with these ironclad rules for dealing with everything. And for governance, it's not going to work that way. So we clearly have two responsible entities other than the major grant committee, right? ZF has constraints that we have to put on them about OFAC, KYC, not embezzling the funds, using things in part of towards a mission. And then the community governance panel gets to elect these people. And so if things go wrong, well, the obvious point is now you need to invent an impeachment procedure, and that's going to be the community governance panel for now. I agree with Andrew's point that ideally we should, get something better longer term, but for now this is what we have, and so we go with that, right? And that'll be the way this goes forwards. And the point is we need to stick to the outline of that idea, right? So, for example, if things go wrong and we need to replace somebody because they're being egregious, then it would be good if we all agree that, yep, the community governance panel is the people who take care of it for now, or its designated successor. We don't, for example, have people coming and proposing, hey, now let's go do a completely different coin holder staked vote as another mechanism. Because when you start having different mechanisms to do different things, it sort of undermines institutions and democratic ideals and everything. Because you can just call your voting mechanism for what you want to get in effect instead of it being the thing we agreed on as a society, as a community.
That's why I think fire alarms are so important, because if there's not a fire alarm, then some people show up, like they'll complain on a thread saying, this is really urgent, this is not ZIP 1014. And as a community, how do we know, okay, does this particular poster on this particular thread, does that rise to a threshold, or is it just them, or?
At the end of the day, if you can't convince the people on the community governance panel or the people on the ZF board, then you're going to get ignored, even if there was a fire alarm. So I don't think we just need a commons in which you can make that announcement. And if everyone decides to ignore you, well, then you're the boy who cried wolf. And hopefully it wasn't an actual wolf this time.
Yeah, we don't want a process that is vulnerable to trolls.
Yeah. Like we can all use our own judgment. Right, we all know each other. We're all, honest in that sense. We're not malicious, right? So,
I mean, to play devil's advocate, though, Ian, you just mentioned not using a coin holders vote, but that's just one way to assess if something is urgent. Like, what if there's a forum poll and somebody says, oh no, that's not legitimate enough because it's just the forum and that's not representative enough.
You're missing the point. It's whether you convince the community governance panel to do something, right? Or if it's the like outside admission stuff, you convince the ZF and the board, who I'm a member of, to do something, right? And you can use whatever evidence you want to do that. What you can't do is go later and say, hey, I don't think this guy should be an MGRC member. I've held a coin holder vote that said he lost. He is being removed. Right. So that is illegitimate.
Right. So it sounds like
the community governance panel will have to do that.
The fire alarm is somebody saying, hey, I call on the community governance panel to convene now because of X, right? I think that's a pretty clear thing that sounds like makes
just keep in mind that may be ignored if it's not a credible case, right? Like,
sure. Yep.
There's a question in the chat, but I wanted to add my own question to Nathan's point. Is right now the foundation is the one that calls the community panel, right? Obviously in line with what the zips say and all that. So is that consistently how the CAP will be convened, by call on the ZF?
I think we should do our best to continually improve it. Like we've tweaked the format and the mechanism of changing, members a little bit. But I think that this is a good example of something that could be part of the process of the cap. Like, what are the rules for forming it? Like, what kind of threshold of attention do you get before like it should be called? And I think that those are things that we should probably work on and be finding ways to improve. I think that one example of a template that could be used for that is the idea of petitions preceding a formal community approval panel. So I think someone who makes a forum poll or who does an ill-fated coin holders poll experiment, maybe those won't be binding in terms of immediately kicking out an MGRC member, but they could be credible to the point of they're influential in forming the call of the next community approval panel.
So
as for calling the community panel, the ZIP says the ZF shall continue to operate the community panel and should work towards making it more representative and independent.
Yeah.
I think just to Nathan's point, Nathan, is it correct in saying that you would like some other possible way? It doesn't say the Zcash Foundation exclusively can call the panel together. And then at what point is this a legitimate election if two people decide to show up and, oh, we have our 100% vote in this direction? Like, obviously that doesn't make any sense.
So I'm pretty comfortable even if that part of the process is ambiguous, as long as like the trigger for the process is really clear. So I could, if the trigger is saying like the magic phrase, I advocate for the community governance panel being convened to decide on this, then that's good enough for me, because that allows for like an irate forum post to not say that, but to sound very irate, and everyone will know, okay, that person is not trying to actually convene the governance panel. It's just about making the intent really clear and unambiguous for everyone in the community, more so than what process that triggers.
I think it is going to have to be slightly ambiguous, because the only voting mechanism we have that we've agreed on, that the ZIP specified as community governance panel, says, as Dara rightfully pointed out, that right now ZF has the ability to convene it and should work on improving it, which I agree on. But we can't have like any one person be able to invoke a bunch of people having to go and spend some time voting on stuff, right? That's just obviously going to get trolled. So it's going to have to be, we trust the leaders of the community to like put the requisite political pressure on, in this case, ZF, that if it's a thing that needs to be called, it gets called. And yeah, we can work towards finding a better solution longer term, but that's the solution we have right now per the ZIP and per the things are going. And I think that's fine.
So we have a good question that kind of goes back to the previous conversation about maybe is the MGRC out of line or something. Can people petition to the foundation or to the ECC to use the trademark agreement? So if an MGRC grant is clearly outside of the trademark, what does that mean for us to do?
If I recall correctly, the trademark is held by just ZF and ECC, right?
Yes.
So however the hell we decide what to do about that, we could do whatever we wanted with it. And if the MGRC wants to use it, we should probably let them, but we get to decide that. And then if they
I think the question is more about, if a grant is out there that clearly might violate the trademark agreement, doesn't that mean the ECC/foundation can come together being like, this is a violation, we want to veto this grant? That's my interpretation.
It's just such a separate nature of like trademark disputes are just such a separate nature of grants. I mean, we could admit their grant and yet also wage a holy war of trying to get them to cease and desist their trademark violation.
Yeah, you could end up in a weird, if things went really bad, which again, we all get into weird rat holes on worst case stuff because we're security people and programmers. Things went bad. In theory, the MGRC could fund someone who wanted to use the Zcash trademark. They could go about doing that, and then ZF and ECC might have to sue them, the funded entity, to stop them using the trademark. And that would be rather bizarre, and I'd hope it wouldn't happen. But yeah, funding and trademarks are separate. And again, I don't expect that to happen because, we're not all assholes. So it should be fine, assuming we don't elect awful people to the MGRC, which I don't think will happen.
Here's a good question, kind of outside of the scope, but don't all the same complications about replacements, potential egregious malfeasance, etc., equally apply to the equally sized and equally fragile ZF board?
Yeah, I mean they do. No governance structure is, designed to basically prevent, I don't know, to guarantee success in spite of all of the people making up the board failing or, sucking at their job, for example.
Right.
So, I mean, we have lots of structures that indicate how, we are supposed to have, terms and go up for staggered re-election in our bylaws, for example.
Yeah, ZF has its own governance process provided by the bylaws. And those are sort of standard things to nonprofits. And those pre-exist the ZIP, and the ZIP basically leaves those untouched. So may or may not be their concern. I think we have good stuff, but it is set, right? They can be expanded. We could decide to do that speaking as a board member, but they exist.
I mean, and the role of transparency and disclosures is pretty important because those basically enable the community to use its veto power of rejecting it or joining a fork or other heavyweight ways of ending the slice to the MGRC or something like that. So at some level, the the root of power lies in the community continuing to go along with it, right? So that is the ultimate veto power. And the structural benefit of policies like disclosure and transparency are basically giving the public the information they would need to coordinate on exercising that veto power. So,
right. So,
yeah, saying dictating specific kinds of decisions, I think, are less of an important structural thing to add than transparency structural measures.
Right. The ZIP's a little unusual, right? There are three entities that get money. There's ZFND, which is a 501c3 with a board and a bunch of transparency requirements, but again, of being a nonprofit. There's the MGRC, which is a thing we created out of whole cloth, which is a committee under the auspices of ZFND for financial reporting purposes. And then there is the Electric Coin Company, which is actually the Zero Coin Electric Coin Company, which is a Delaware LLC with Zucker as CEO and a board of directors. And that's it, right? It's a little weird that the requirements are disparate across them. But that's what we ended up with. And so, yeah, you might have interesting concerns that the Major Grant Committee in some ways has more accountability than either ECC or ZF. But also part of that's for good reason, right? ZF and ECC are known entities, for better or worse. And the MGRC is this completely new thing with a completely bunch of random people who are new to the community. And so, yeah, you're right. We definitely want an accountability mechanism that's explicit.
And it's responsible for 8% of vote awards rather than 7 or 5%.
Yeah, it's pretty big.
Oh, yeah. It's also got more of the money than anyone else. I keep forgetting that detail. And it's supposed to hand them out in the most dicey way possible, right? Grants are the easiest possible thing to, give to your buddies and such.
We have multiple requests to discuss the Q&A session that Hudson is hosting for the candidates. Notably, can we discuss it? And there are some ideas that maybe considering time zones and availability, people can have a Google form with all the questions and the community can answer it. I don't know if we want to focus on that today.
That's a good question. And we could use the time to talk about the structure of it. I think the details and organization of that aren't yet set. So I don't know what all we could talk about here. I guess this is a great place to get brainstorm ideas.
Yeah, I guess I had assumed that was going to be covered on this call. But that may have been a misunderstanding on my part.
Yeah, we just established this call mainly to answer these structural questions and how they apply to the foundation and to the ECC and to the ZIP.
So does it sound like, based on all of the discussion that just took place, it sounds like the answer to a lot of those questions is once the committee members are elected, they will have to form an opinion or decide on this. Or was there? Yeah, that was my impression too. Great.
I volunteered to lead at least one session, like hour or at most an hour and a half. That's kind of my limit for one of those. But there's so many candidates, and they're all very interesting and deserve airtime. So I think that these quick Q&As will turn out really interesting. So I think that the structure of that will basically be several different live calls with different moderators.
And are those like throughout the month of September, or is the idea to have all of them set before September 4th when the polling begins?
Is Hudson on the call? I think he's the one that has the answers to those since he's arranging a lot of it.
Yeah.
I'm sure he's open to suggestion.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think it would be nice to know what people, what they prefer. Like, because we have a Zeal call, like the monthly calls that are scheduled every month. And I had suggested using that call for this type of conversation. But since ECC does have like a candidate in the MGRC and kind of we don't want to, I would feel happy to have that conversation within a Zeal call or cancel the Zeal call and have like all of the attention focused on these MGRC discussions. I just don't know who to look to kind of decide what is best. And it sounds like Hudson is saying whatever the community prefers. And then in this call, it sounds like we're saying whatever Hudson prefers. So I'm happy to do either way. I just kind of need a weather vane to point me somewhere.
I mean, Hudson's doing a great job. And I like that as a candidate, he, you know, and community led decided to arrange some of these calls. I'm sure he's more than open to our suggestions. I don't know what else to add.
Yeah, and I think it's nice that this was a grassroots thing that came out of the community. So we can talk to Hudson. I actually don't even know what time zone he's in these days. I know where he used to live, but given COVID and everyone relocating, I have no idea.
I do know that he is looking for moderators. Andrew has volunteered to be one, and depending on the number of calls, it might require at least 2 or 3 moderators to help him out.
I would expect it's likely that some of these, you know, continue. I would be very surprised if we could get all of them done before the poll opens on September 4th. So I would not be surprised. I mean, it's nice to get a bunch of them done earlier, but I would imagine
we do
there's no reason they have to be all done right before they start.
Right, and we do have another Zcash Foundation led community call on September 4th to showcase all the candidates as well. So that could take care of some of the questions. Well, one thing I did want to, so I know that Hudson is looking for moderators. If you guys have any ideas, Elena, I know, and I and Andre have been helping him. We're happy to, you know, point you towards Hudson if you'd like to moderate one of those calls. And we're looking for people who are neutral and, you know, just asking the good questions and creating a great conversation around it. Iran, would you like to moderate? It just came up on the.
I'd be happy to serve.
Great. Well, if there's no more questions, Andrew, should we wrap it up?
Yeah, we can maybe pause here for enough time that people realize this is their chance to get in their last questions. If otherwise, I'll be happy to conclude early.
I have a non-question that's just appreciation for all of the effort that you've put into preparing this and showing up to share it with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
yeah, appreciate it. And thanks everyone for I'm assuming interpreting that as directed at everyone showing up here. It's been a lot of discussion and engagement, and continuing to be kind of amazed that continue to have enthusiasm for this growing process.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize something that it's important as a community going forward that even if you disagree with, how things are being done, or even the way things are being governed, like the method by which elections happen and such, that we all agree on what was done and who are the winners and the losers, because that is the fundamental thing in any sort of quasi-democratic institution is people being able to tell when they won and lost. And one of the worries as we go forwards, and we particularly in cryptocurrencies, these things turn to sort of governance science fair projects, is that we lose track of that, and that the ambiguities cause people to run with what they wanted, and that'll just cause disagreement, right? So whenever possible, we need to sort of stick to what we agreed in or the spirit of it, even if it's not ideal. And of course, we have the mechanism to change that, and if it's reasonable, that can be easily done. But for better or worse, the community governance panel is what we have right now.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty well stated point, and some of the things we discussed here, like I thought it was really important to go discuss what the tiebreaker policy was, just because that's a kind of good example of something that could easily, happen, and it's better to have articulated a process ahead of time than simply be surprised or have people needlessly fork, is the way I would say it.
Yep.
I think that's a great point, Ian. And I would ask, given that the foundation has just opened up the cap for expanded membership, I think it would be great if everyone who's already a member would be real intentional and thoughtful about who they bring in as their +1, and specifically think about who could you bring in that brings something to the table that we don't already have? Who could you tap that may not even work in our industry whatsoever, but has a really unique or valuable perspective? I think that would really help the project.
Yeah, that's a really nice point.
Yeah, and also there's just this concept of, disagree and commit. Like, we may not have wanted to do it this way. I may not have wanted this to go on this way. This is what we agreed on. And so there is a time and a place, probably for the next election of the MGRC, when you get to re-disagree and argue to your heart's content and change things to do whatever crazy quadratic voting scheme you have in mind. But until then, we have to stick to the core of what we did, because otherwise we'll blow up this entire thing. We'll become the laughing stock of everyone, and HTTPS for money will die. So there.
Ian being dramatic as usual, but right, I think.
Okay, well, I think this is a pretty good positive note to conclude on. You'll back 15 minutes of your lives to enjoy.
Yeah, and I do actually think we'll make it, like, to echo what Aditya said. Like, I actually have hope for this, and I'm pretty cynical, for those of you who know me. So yeah, have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Okay.
Bye, all.
Bye, all.
I guess that name for our morning is fucking close.